The Dark Scrolls. In 15th century England, when the air still smelled of smoke and iron from civil war, a woman appeared whose beauty and composure seemed to disturb the natural order. Her name was Elizabeth Woodville. She was not born of noble blood, nor raised within the glittering corridors of court. She was the daughter of a knight and the widow of a fallen soldier, a woman who should have lived quietly among the minor gentry. Yet her path crossed with a young king, Edward IV of York, and from that moment, both their fates began to move toward legend. England then was bleeding from the Wars of the Roses, a struggle between the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York. Power shifted as quickly as the seasons. Thrones were won and lost in a single campaign. Edward, newly crowned after a string of daring victories, was the embodiment of a warrior king, handsome, reckless, and confident that fortune obeyed him. Elizabeth, in contrast, was the image of endurance. Her husband, Sir John Grey, had died fighting for the opposing side. Left with 2 sons and no protection, she waited on the roadside near Grafton to plead for the return of her seized lands. That morning, the chronicles say, the king rode through with his retinue. She stepped forward, cloaked in mourning black, her 2 children beside her. Edward stopped his horse. The exchange that followed was brief, but something in her manner, dignified yet desperate, seemed to pierce through the noise of his triumph. He promised to hear her case, and within weeks he returned. What began as an act of mercy turned into fascination, and fascination into defiance of every law of politics. Against all counsel, Edward married her in secret. A widowed commoner had become Queen of England. When the marriage was revealed, the court froze in disbelief. The great lords, especially the powerful Earl of Warwick, had spent years arranging diplomatic unions that might strengthen the crown. Now the king had destroyed those plans for a woman with no royal lineage. To explain such madness, rumor reached for the supernatural. It was said she carried charms, that her mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, practiced magic, that a spell had turned the king's reason to fog. Accusations of witchcraft were the convenient language of envy. Medieval minds sought patterns. If a woman of modest birth could command a king's heart, surely unseen forces were at work. Elizabeth's grace and quiet control unsettled courtiers used to arrogance. They saw calculation where there might have been courage, and enchantment where there might have been simple presence. The whispers grew. A lock of hair bound with silk, a candle burning at midnight, a queen whose touch made men forget their vows. Yet, beyond superstition, the marriage revealed the deep tremor running through England's hierarchy. The Woodvilles represented a new idea, that favor could rise from merit and charm, not only from ancient blood. To old families, this was heresy. Her brothers were knighted, her sisters given to noble husbands, her father elevated. Each promotion felt to the old guard like another spell woven over the realm. Warwick, furious, called her clan upstarts and began to plot rebellion. Still, for a few bright years, Elizabeth's image triumphed over resentment. Her coronation in 1465 was staged with theatrical brilliance. Beneath a canopy of gold, she entered Westminster in a gown embroidered with silver stars, her long hair flowing freely, an emblem of both purity and power. The crowds, dazzled, fell silent. Even her enemies admitted her poise. Some said that when she walked past, candles seemed to burn steadier. as if the air itself respected her. But England was not built for fairy tales. Every gesture of hers fed new suspicion. When she placed her relatives in positions of influence, the nobles saw witchcraft of a different sort, political enchantment. When Edward's foreign alliances crumbled, they blamed the Queen's spell. The myth of Elizabeth the sorceress became a weapon sharper than any sword. It was whispered that she mixed love potions, that she summoned favorable winds for her husband's fleets, that her beauty could not age because it was preserved by forbidden rites. Behind the glitter of ceremony, she must have sensed how fragile her triumph was. The same gaze that adored her could turn accusing in an instant. She moved with calculated stillness, speaking softly, always careful to reveal nothing that might feed the legends. And yet, the legends fed themselves. Chroniclers wrote of her as both saint and siren, the mirror in which England's unease saw its own reflection. To modernize, her story reads as the collision of power and perception. A woman who dared to act with agency in a world ruled by men became an object of fear. To her contemporaries, the marriage looked like seduction. To history, it might look like strategy or simple love. No witness could separate one from the other. In those early years beside Edward, she seemed to balance two worlds, the earthly realm of politics and the shadowed realm of rumor. She bore him sons and daughters, cementing the Yorkist line. For a moment, stability seemed possible, yet every celebration carried an undertone of threat. Behind the velvet curtains of the palace, whispers persisted that the king's passion would cost the crown itself. When the chroniclers describe their union, they do not agree whether it was blessed or cursed. Some write of a fateful tenderness, others of a reckless obsession. But all agree that the day Edward placed the ring upon her hand, England changed course. In that instant, the logic of bloodlines gave way to the mystery of attraction, and the line between love and sorcery blurred forever. For a time, happiness held, but England, restless and watchful, would not forgive its queen so easily. The woman who once knelt on a country road to plead for justice had risen too high, too quickly, and in the dim corridors of power, where envy whispered louder than prayer, the name Elizabeth Woodville began to carry another meaning, one that would follow her into every shadow that came after. Power, once gained through love, rarely keeps its innocence. In the years that followed her secret marriage, Elizabeth Woodville learned this truth in the cold language of court politics. The crown that glittered upon her brow became both armor and target. Each privilege granted to her family tightened the noose around her reputation, until the name Woodville itself began to stir anger in the corridors of power. Edward IV adored his queen. He delighted in her presence and lavished favor upon her kin. Her father, Richard Woodville, was raised to Earl Rivers. Her brothers were granted lands, offices, and noble brides. Her sisters were placed into alliances that bound the highest houses of England to the blood of a woman they still called common. To the old nobility who had spilled generations of blood to preserve lineage, this rise of lesser stock was intolerable. They looked upon Elizabeth's calm smile and saw not grace, but manipulation. The whispers began to grow teeth. It was said the Woodvilles never slept without candles burning through the night, but strange symbols were scratched on the wax. Servants claimed to hear chanting from the Queen's chambers when storms rattled the windows of Westminster. Some swore that on the night of her coronation, a wind rose suddenly from the Thames, lifting her veil in a motion too deliberate to be chance. The chroniclers who served her enemies recorded these things without evidence. But in an age when the border between faith and fear was thin, rumor could command the same authority as proof. The Queen's composure did not falter. She carried herself with the serenity of a saint and the intelligence of a statesman. Yet that very serenity made her seem inhuman to those who despised her. When she did not rage, they said she plotted. When she smiled, they said she was smiling at a secret no one else could see. The chronicler Dominic Mancini would later write that she possessed a certain unearthly dignity which seemed to chill the hearts of those around her. In another time, it might have been praise. In the 15th century, it was an accusation. Her greatest adversary, the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, had once stood at Edward's side as the maker of crowns. Now he saw his influence waning beneath the soft hand of a queen who owed him nothing. The alliance he had built with France, meant to secure England's peace, was shattered when Edward married Elizabeth. Warwick's rage curdled into vengeance. He began to speak openly that the king had fallen under enchantment, that Edward's sudden passion was not love, but sorcery. The story spread faster than armies could march. In the alehouses of London, people whispered of Jacquetta of Luxembourg, Elizabeth's mother, who had once been accused of witchcraft years earlier. She had been cleared of the charge, but memory in England was long. Some said she had taught her daughter the art of binding hearts with moonlit spells. Others claimed that when Edward rode into battle, he carried a charm against iron that the Queen herself had tied around his neck. Even Edward's victories were turned against him, each triumph said to be the work of his wife's invisible hand. The Woodvilles continued to rise. John Woodville married the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, a match that scandalized the realm for its brazenness. Anthony Woodville, Elizabeth's cultured brother, became one of the most admired knights of the court, handsome, educated, and devout, yet accused of using poetry to mask ambition. The Queen's father governed with moderation, but moderation mattered little to envy. Every act of governance by a Woodville was seen as self-serving, every act of generosity as manipulation. Warwick's resentment turned to rebellion. In 1469, he joined with Edward's brother, George, Duke of Clarence, to raise an army against the king. The rebellion was cloaked in the language of righteousness, claiming that the Queen and her kin had bewitched Edward into ruin. When Warwick's forces triumphed briefly and captured the king, the Queen's family was hunted. Elizabeth, pregnant again, fled to sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. There, within the holy walls, she gave birth to a son, Edward, the prince who would one day be proclaimed King Edward V. The image of a queen giving birth among the relics of saints while her enemies prowled the city outside left a deep mark on England's imagination. Some saw in it divine favor. Others saw mockery. A witch birthing her heir in a church, defiling the sacred with her presence. The myths began to twist upon themselves. If the king's fortune rose, Elizabeth was blessed by heaven. If it fell, she was cursed by hell. She had become a vessel into which the age poured its every superstition. When Edward regained his throne and Warwick fled to France, the king's forgiveness was swift but incomplete. England's peace was only a pause between storms. Warwick returned with an army, invaded, and for a time restored Henry VI to the throne. Elizabeth again sought sanctuary, this time not merely as a queen in danger, but as a woman, realizing how precarious her crown truly was. The air of majesty she had worn so carefully was stripped by fear. In those hidden rooms of the abbey, surrounded by her children and a handful of loyal attendants, She must have wondered whether all the power she had gathered had been a mirage built on affection too fragile to last. Warwick's triumph proved brief. Edward returned from exile, his army stronger, his will hardened. The battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury crushed the rebellion. Warwick fell, and Henry VI was murdered in the Tower. Elizabeth emerged from sanctuary again, this time not as the young enchantress of Grafton, but as a queen tempered by exile and loss. Yet her enemies did not vanish with Warwick. They had merely learned to move in quieter corridors. At court, smiles hid daggers. The Woodvilles remained powerful, but power had turned sour. Even among the Yorkist nobility, resentment grew. The Queen's brothers were envied for their titles, her daughters for their beauty, her influence over the king for its persistence. Whenever Edward made an unpopular decision, courtiers blamed the Queen's counsel. Whenever the royal treasury strained, they spoke of Woodville greed. England could not forgive what it refused to understand. A woman who held power not by inheritance, but by intellect and poise. Through all this, Elizabeth became increasingly silent. Chroniclers note her fondness for prayer and her preference for twilight, hours when courtiers avoided the palace halls and she could walk alone among the candle-lit tapestries. To some, her quiet was evidence of guilt. To others, it was the stillness of a woman who had learned the cost of every word. The court poets likened her to the Morgana of Arthurian legend, beautiful, wise, and dangerous. Yet the real danger lay not in any spells she cast, but in the imagination of those who could not bear to see a queen whose influence came from something deeper than blood. Edward's reign entered its later years gilded in apparent peace. The wars were over, trade returned, and the court glimmered with celebration. But beneath the golden surface, factions plotted. The Duke of Clarence's discontent smoldered until Edward ordered his execution. A death sealed, the people whispered, by the Queen's persuasion. They said she had demanded it, that she poured venom into the king's ear while he slept. Even mercy in her hands became suspect. The pattern was cruel and constant. When plague spared her children, she was a sorceress. When it took her relatives, it was divine justice. When her mother Jacquetta died, mourners left crosses at her door. But some were not of blessing, but of warning. The legend of the Woodville witches had become inseparable from the legend of England itself. It was said that their blood carried a charm both protective and destructive, that no ruler who wronged them would die peacefully. Such tales would echo long after Elizabeth herself was gone. In those later years, she devoted herself to education and to her son, the young Prince of Wales. She encouraged Anthony Woodville's translation of moral texts from French, hoping to craft an image of refinement around the dynasty her marriage had founded. But refinement could not erase resentment. For every illuminated manuscript produced under her patronage, a dozen unseen hands sharpened quills to write her downfall. The kingdom's mood was shifting again. Edward, once the embodiment of strength, began to decline. His body softened, his will clouded by indulgence. Elizabeth watched as the man who had defied the world for her became a shadow of the warrior she had loved. In the silence of the chapel, she prayed, but it is said that even there her stillness unnerved the priests. Some swore her lips moved in words older than Latin. Others said that when she knelt, the candles bent toward her flame. Yet no record shows malice in her actions. She arranged marriages, negotiated treaties, secured her children's future. Her power was the quiet kind, the power of patience. But England, steeped in suspicion, mistook patience for plotting. The noble houses whispered that she meant to rule through her sons, that she sought to eclipse the memory of York with her own dynasty. The image of Elizabeth as the White Witch of Westminster grew larger than the woman herself. By the time Edward lay dying in 1483, the web of hatred woven around the Woodvilles had become unbreakable. The Queen's enemies waited like wolves. They would not strike until the king's breath had left his body, but their plans were already written. Elizabeth, sensing what was to come, began quietly moving her children to safety, arranging safe corridors of loyalty where she could. Her intuition, called witchcraft by her foes, was in truth the survival instinct of someone who had lived too long in the shadow of men's ambitions. History would later remember those final months as the calm before England's darkest storm. The Queen, surrounded by her family's splendor, must have felt the air thickening with premonition. The court smiled for the last time. Banquets still glittered, but the music faltered sooner each night. In the eyes of her courtiers, she could read the prophecy of what they would do once Edward was gone. For nearly 2 decades she had ruled beside him, hated, envied, but never broken. She had endured exile, rebellion, and the loss of allies, yet her crown remained. Still, she knew that the hatred which had sustained itself through rumor and fear would not die with the king. It would simply shift its shape, turning toward her sons, toward the heirs she had borne in both love and defiance. And so the legend deepened. Elizabeth Woodville, the commoner who became queen, was no longer merely a woman. She had become a symbol of female will in a world afraid of it, of power gained not by sword, but by mind. Her enemies saw in her a witch because they could not see her as human. Her silence was a mirror to their own guilt, and in that reflection they saw devils. The chronicles of her age would endow her with shadows she never cast, and centuries later the stories would still circle back to that one impossible question. How could a widow from Grafton have ensnared a king, defied a nation, and survived the hatred of a realm that never wanted her? The answer, perhaps, lies not in witchcraft, but in something England had never understood. A woman who refused to vanish. When the king died, England seemed to stop breathing. Edward IV, the golden monarch who had once lit the battlefield with his brilliance, lay silent in the spring of 1483. His sudden death at 40 left the realm adrift, and with it, the woman who had ruled beside him for nearly 2 decades found herself standing at the edge of an abyss. Elizabeth Woodville, the queen who had once commanded the envy of lords, was now a widow once more. And this time, there would be no gallant king to rescue her from the tide that turned against her. The court that had once bowed before her was now a court of strangers. Men who had smiled at her table now whispered in corridors, testing the air for the scent of change. The Woodvilles, who had climbed the staircase of power rung by rung, could feel it trembling beneath them. For years they had lived in the light of Edward's protection. With his passing, that light went out, leaving only shadows. The new king, Edward V, was 12 years old. Bright, well-mannered, and adored by his mother, he was to be crowned within weeks, but in the uncertain world of medieval succession, A child's crown was a dangerous thing. Edward's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, brother to the late king, was named Lord Protector. The arrangement should have promised stability. Instead, it set into motion one of the most haunting chapters in England's history. From the moment Richard began his journey south to meet the boy king, whispers gathered like storm clouds. He was loyal, they said. He was ruthless, others answered. Meanwhile, Elizabeth remained in London, surrounded by her children and a dwindling circle of allies. She trusted few. The court was thick with factions. Woodville loyalty on one side, Gloucester's men on the other, and behind every courteous exchange was the same unspoken question. Who would rule until the boy could? The Queen Mother had learned long ago that survival meant silence, yet now silence was dangerous. When Richard intercepted her son's escort at Stony Stratford and arrested her brother Anthony Woodville and her second son, Richard Grey, the mask of calm could no longer hold. The Protector had declared that the Woodvilles were plotting to seize power through the boy king. Few questioned the claim. England, always eager for treachery, believed it at once. Elizabeth fled to sanctuary once more, the same stone walls of Westminster Abbey that had sheltered her years before. History repeated itself like a curse. But this time the echoes were darker. She was not the confident queen who had once defied rebellion. She was a hunted widow, clutching her youngest children as soldiers filled the streets. The abbey's candles flickered as if stirred by unseen breath. Within its walls, Elizabeth waited for word from the outside world, though every message brought more dread. In the weeks that followed, her eldest son was taken to the Tower of London, ostensibly for his protection before the coronation. Then came the request that shattered her heart. The demand that her younger son, the little Duke of York, join his brother there, so that the brothers might be together. Some said Elizabeth hesitated for days, walking the echoing cloisters of the abbey at night, torn between mother and subject, faith and fear. At last, perhaps persuaded that resistance would doom them all, she consented. The boy was taken from her arms, carried away beneath the watch of Gloucester's men. What she could not know was that this would be the last time she would ever see her sons alive. The days turned to weeks. No coronation was held. Rumors seeped through the streets of London like mist through graveyards. It was said that the princes were seen at the tower's windows, pale and silent, waving once before vanishing from sight. Then came the proclamations that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth had been invalid, that he had been betrothed to another before her, and that her children were therefore bastards. The council declared the throne vacant. On a July day, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned Richard III, and the Queen, who had once ruled England, found herself erased from its order. For the first time, Elizabeth's composure cracked. Chroniclers record her retreat deeper into the abbey, fasting, weeping, praying through the nights. To the priests who heard her prayers, it sounded less like petition and more like lamentation. She was a queen stripped of crown, a mother stripped of sons, a woman who had spent her life mastering silence, now forced to live within it. Outside, the rumors grew darker. Some said the princes had been moved secretly to the north. Others whispered they had died in their sleep. Londoners claimed to see strange lights above the tower on stormy nights. Two small flames, that flickered and vanished. The truth was swallowed by history before it could even be written. What remained was the ache of not knowing, and the belief that some ancient curse had finally claimed the house that had once risen too high. The people began to speak of the Woodville curse, though no one could say who had first uttered it. Some said it began with Elizabeth's mother, Jacata, who was said to have bound the family's fortunes to the moon, waxing with favor, waning with betrayal. Others believed that Elizabeth herself had sealed her fate the day she married Edward IV, binding love and doom in one breath. To the superstitious, the deaths and disappearances that followed seemed less like coincidence and more like payment. The Queen Mother did not curse aloud, but those close to her wrote that her grief had a terrible stillness, the kind that unsettled even the pious. She prayed constantly, yet her prayers were unlike any others. When a priest asked what she sought, she replied simply, that justice finds its own name. Justice, however, remained silent. Her brother Anthony was executed on false charges of treason. Her son, Richard Grey, met the same fate. The Tower stones held its secrets close, and England, weary of blood, turned its face from sorrow. The new king's reign was proclaimed lawful, but no peace followed. The land itself seemed restless, the harvests thin, the skies thick with thunder. Chroniclers, eager to find pattern in misfortune, began to write of divine retribution, of the sins of witchcraft returning to haunt their maker. Yet to those who knew her, Elizabeth in these years was no witch but a ghost. Pale, withdrawn, her beauty dimmed not by age but by exhaustion. The court that had once resented her now regarded her with uneasy pity. She remained in sanctuary until 1484, when Richard, in a calculated act of mercy, promised her safety and restored some lands to her name. She emerged from the abbey's gates like one stepping from the tomb. If she had ever believed in her own power to shape fate, that belief was gone. What remained was endurance. She lived quietly at Bermondsey, near the river, in a house of grey stone where the mists rolled in from the Thames and erased the horizon. Visitors described her as gentle, resigned, a queen who no longer sought to be seen. Yet even in retreat she was not forgotten. For somewhere in England rebellion was stirring. Henry Tudor, a distant relative of the Lancastrian line, began to gather supporters across the Channel in Brittany. Those who opposed Richard III looked to Elizabeth as the rightful mother of England's heirs. And though she had lost her sons to the Tower, she still had daughters. The eldest, Elizabeth of York, carried both the blood of York and Woodville, and thus, through her, the possibility of reconciliation. It was in these years of quiet plotting that Elizabeth performed what history would later interpret as her final act of cunning, or courage, depending on who told it. She reached out in secret correspondence to Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's mother, arranging the promise that, if Henry triumphed, he would marry her daughter. It was not a spell, but a negotiation, yet, in a sense, it was the last enchantment of the Woodville line, to weave a new dynasty from the ruin of two. When Henry landed in 1485 and marched toward destiny, Elizabeth remained silent. She did not attend Richard's court, nor his downfall at Bosworth. But when news came that the last Yorkist king had fallen and Henry Tudor was crowned Henry VII, she knew that the tides of fate had turned once more. Her daughter would be queen, and through that union, the Tudor dynasty would begin. But it was a triumph bought with too much pain to celebrate. She had lost her husband, her brothers, her sons, and the trust of a kingdom. The world that once feared her power now pitied her solitude. She lived to see her daughter crowned beside the man who ended the wars that had consumed England. And for a brief moment, the curse seemed lifted. But Elizabeth Woodville, ever the woman of quiet foresight, knew that peace built upon graves was only another kind of silence. In her final years, she withdrew almost entirely from court life, preferring prayer and solitude at Bermondsey Abbey. Chroniclers note that her rooms were sparse, her table simple, her days marked by ritual. She read psalms each morning and lit candles for her lost children each night. The servants said she spoke rarely, except in sleep, when she murmured names no one recognized. When she died in 1492, her burial was modest, far from the grandeur of a queen. There were no royal processions, no gilded coffins. She was laid to rest beside Edward in St. Molly, George's Chapel, Windsor, under the same vaulted shadows that had once echoed with their vows. The records say rain fell that day, a thin, cold drizzle that blurred the ink on the mourners' lists. But those who stood close enough to see her face said that, in death, she looked not sorrowful but peaceful, as though she had finally found the silence she had sought for years. And yet, the legends refused to die. The princes in the Tower remained missing, their fate unsolved. Each new reign rekindled the rumors that their ghosts walked the battlements, that their whispers could still be heard at midnight, calling for their mother. Poets wrote that Elizabeth's spirit visited the Tower each year on the anniversary of their disappearance, her white veil drifting like mist along the stones. The people called her the White Queen, half in reverence, half in fear. Even centuries later, when the bones of two children were discovered beneath the Tower's staircase, the question remained unanswered. Were they hers? Were they the proof of Richard's guilt, or the relics of England's curse? History offered no clarity. Only the silence remained, the same silence that had wrapped itself around Elizabeth in those final days. Some historians would argue that Elizabeth Woodville's downfall was not the work of fate, nor witchcraft, but the predictable end of a world unready for her kind of power. Yet to those who look deeper into her story, there lingers a sense that something older and darker moved through her life. A shadow born from love and ambition, woven through the bloodlines of kings. In that shadow, she endures. The widow on the road, the queen in the chapel, the mother in the abbey, the ghost in the tower, all are one. Her story did not end with her death, nor even with the rise of the Tudors. It continued in the fear that haunted every English monarch who followed, that power gained through beauty, wit, or will must one day be repaid in grief. And so, when the bells of Windsor toll at dusk and the mist rises from the river, the legend says her voice can still be heard, soft, steady, neither curse nor prayer, but something between. Not a queen's lament, nor a witch's spell, but the quiet truth of a woman who loved too fiercely and lost too much. They said I bound him with magic, her echo seems to say. But love was the only spell I ever knew. Centuries have passed, yet the name Woodville still carries an echo that trembles between reverence and suspicion. Time has softened the faces in the portraits, but the stories that cling to them remain sharp. Elizabeth Woodville, once queen, widow and mother of lost princes, became less a person than a symbol of the dangerous beauty of influence, of the peril that followed women who dared to stand beside power instead of behind it. Historians call her life extraordinary. Poets call it haunted. Each generation reshapes her image, painting her as saint, schemer, or sorceress according to its own fears. In the shadowed corners of archives and abbeys, fragments of her legend survive. A locket said to hold her prayer written in cipher. A mirror rumored to have belonged to her mother, Jaquetta, said to reveal truths unfit for men to bear. Whether such relics are real or invention matters little now. What endures is the sense that Elizabeth's life was a bridge between the earthly and the otherworldly, a reminder of how superstition could become history's ink. The myths of her magic were perhaps born from misunderstanding. To command a king's heart without armies or fortune seemed unnatural to a world ruled by lineage and men. To survive rebellions, sanctuaries, and betrayals required an instinct so sharp it felt prophetic. Her composure, calm, deliberate, unreadable, looked to contemporaries like sorcery, because it was something rarer. Intelligence cloaked in restraint. When she spoke, people listened. When she acted, the course of kingdoms shifted. That, in the 15th century, was spellcraft enough. After her death, the Tudor kings who inherited her bloodline quietly erased her from their official memory. She was too troubling a ghost for a dynasty that wished to appear divinely ordained. Yet she lived on in whispers. Ballads spoke of the White Queen who walked by moonlight along the Thames. In some versions, she carried a lantern searching for her lost sons. In others, she held a mirror that showed the faces of every monarch descended from her line, each destined to meet sorrow before peace. And indeed, sorrow seemed to follow them. Her grandson, Henry VIII, would execute wives and friends alike. Her great-granddaughter, Mary, would burn heretics in the name of faith. Even Elizabeth I, who bore her name, lived beneath the weight of isolation, her throne secured by blood. Superstition wove these tragedies into a pattern and called it the Woodville curse, the price paid for a crown won by forbidden charm. Perhaps it was coincidence, or perhaps, as some chroniclers whispered, the sins of England's suspicion never truly died, but returned in the misfortunes of its heirs. Yet the truer legacy she left was not a curse, but a quiet revolution. Through her daughter, she joined the blood of York and Lancaster, ending a war that had drained a nation. Through that union, the Tudor age was born, an era that would shape England's destiny for centuries. The woman once condemned as a witch became, through time's slow forgiveness, the ancestral mother of peace. Still, even as the historians clear her name, they cannot dispel the aura that clings to it. There is something haunting in how she endured, how, when stripped of everything, she turned to silence and outlasted every enemy. Perhaps the world senses in her story a kind of enchantment after all. Not one born of spells, but of resilience, of the refusal to be forgotten. The same patience that once unsettled courtiers now commands respect. The same composure that drew fear now reads as strength. What her enemies called sorcery may have been the rarest form of human power, the ability to endure without hate. In the end, her so-called witchcraft was only a mirror held to the age she lived in. It reflected men's ambition, their terror of the feminine unknown, their desperate need to explain love and loss in terms of fate. The Woodville witches were never witches at all, but witnesses, women who survived a world that could not name their intelligence without damning it. And so, as the centuries fade, their legend remains. In the stillness of Windsor Chapel, where her tomb lies beside Edward's, the air carries a strange quiet. Visitors say that at dusk the candles tremble, though no wind passes, and for a heartbeat the silence feels alive, as if history itself is breathing. Perhaps it is only imagination. Perhaps something older lingers, not malevolent, not divine, merely human. A trace of grief that refuses to die. For in the ashes of history, beneath the dust of war and rumor, their voices endure. Not the chants of sorcery, not the murmurs of ambition, but something softer, older, and infinitely sadder. The sound of love, surviving the centuries, stripped of its crown yet unwilling to vanish. And if one listens closely, beyond the creak of stone and the whisper of the river, one might still hear the final echo of that legend. In the ashes of history, the Woodville witches still whisper, not spells, but sorrow. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.